everything is fine and that all of our democratic countries are doing well. And in fact, I think that one of the biggest dangers in a modern democracy is complacency. And I actually think the performance of many democracies is not good. And that applies to this region, Latin America, as much as any other part of the world. If there is a single reason why I think democracy is not doing well around the world today, it is the following. It is because in many democracies there is a failure of governance, meaning that democratically elected governments do not provide the substance of what people want from a government. What people want is personal security. They want education. They want health care. They want infrastructure and the conditions under which individual initiative can take place, a market economy can flourish, people can live their lives according to the opportunities that they create. But the government has to provide those things, and many governments around the world have failed at doing that, and because they've made a failure of governing, democracy itself becomes delegitimated. And there are many contemporary examples of this. Look at Ukraine. So Ukraine had an orange revolution in December 2004. Mr. Yanukovych, who had stolen an election, was forced to stand for election again. He was voted out of office, and then a new democratically elected orange coalition took power. That orange coalition could not govern. They spent all of their time fighting with each other. They did not seriously deal with the pervasive corruption that infects the government of Ukraine. And as a result, Mr. Yanukovych was reelected in 2010. If the Orange Coalition had understood better how to actually govern Ukraine and deliver basic services without corruption, they would still be in power. And you wouldn't have had the crisis now involving Russia that we've seen unfold in the last few months. Take another country, India, which is oftentimes compared to China. India has got big problems. The growth rate there has slowed down even more dramatically than it has in Latin America. And from going from the position of being one of the fastest growing countries in the world, India is now looking at much poorer performance. A lot of this is due to the failures of democracy in India. It is virtually impossible to get anything done in India. It is hard to build airports, dams, bridges, basic infrastructure. The Indians are far behind the Chinese in their ability to provide basic clean water and electricity to their own population. And part of the reason for that is, in a certain sense, the cumbersomeness of both the legal and the political systems in India. The Indian Supreme Court, so India has a very deep rule of law tradition. The Indian Supreme Court has a backlog of 60,000 cases that it has yet to decide. Many Indians, when they go to the courts, die before their court comes before a judge. And so the system is extremely slow and inefficient. And this is why, unlike the Chinese, they cannot produce an infrastructure project. And this is why I think Mr. Modi was elected in the most recent election with a fairly impressive majority in the Indian parliament, because he showed himself to be a strong leader in Gujarat. And I think many Indians are hoping that he can do the same thing, that he can break through all of the constraints on decision-making that exist in the Indian system. We get to Latin America. This was a topic of my lecture this morning at ASON. I think that Latin America should be proud of the way that most of the countries in this region, there are some exceptions, but most of the countries in this region have succeeded in consolidating democracy. That was the big struggle in the 70s, 80s, 90s, was to get out of military government, to respect human rights, to establish democratic institutions. And I think Peru is a case of a country that has done that very effectively. And not only that, it has succeeded in growing economically and creating a middle class and creating a social basis for stable democracy. But the new task that I think lies in front of every country in this region is to actually govern effectively by building the capacity of the state to deliver basic services. One of the most basic services that is lacking in many Latin American countries is security, personal security, the ability to send your child to school or to get to your job without being molested by a narco gang, without having to pay bribes, without dealing with ordinary criminality. This is not an unsolvable problem. The United States went through a very large crime wave in the past generation, but it is one that many countries have not yet stepped up to. Education is another area where many Latin American countries have succeeded in dramatically expanding access to education, but they've been very, very much stymied in improving the quality of education. And without higher quality education, the competitiveness, the economic competitiveness of this region is going to lag very severely. And so this is a problem, I think, that as I argued this morning, I think the next phase of political development in this region is going to be the increasing of state capacity. We've moved, in a certain sense, fortunately, beyond the consolidating of democracy, and now we actually have to go on to the question of how to make governments work better. So I am an American, a North American. I do not want to let my country off the hook that easily, because I think that American government in Washington, D.C. has become extremely dysfunctional. And it is a huge disappointment. I think that whereas at the end of the Cold War, many people looked up to the United States as a model of democracy, I think that that is becoming increasingly hard to do. And I think the reasons for this really have to do with a great deterioration in the just the civility of political discourse in the United States as a result of growing partisanship. It used to be that the two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, overlapped substantially. And you could pass legislation because there was general agreement about many of the features of public policy in the United States. Today, those two parties have drifted so far apart that there is no overlap. The most left-wing Republican is much more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. That didn't used to be the case. And one of the immediate consequences of that is the inability of the American system to make fundamental, important decisions, political decisions. So the U.S. Congress has not passed a budget since 2006. The U.S. Congress sets rules for how to make a budget, and it has not passed a budget in many years. And meanwhile, we go around to countries in Latin America and other parts of the developing world lecturing them on what's good budget practice. But we're not doing it ourselves. Immigration reform, gun control, there are many issues where there's actually a substantial degree of agreement on the part of the American people about important changes in public policy, and we cannot get there because our political system has become dysfunctional in this particular manner. And so in the introduction, there's a reference to the book I'm going to publish in the fall in the United States with the title Political Order and Political Decay. And one of the things I argue in that book is that there has actually been a certain decay of political institutions in my own country. I'm sad to say that, but I think that that is unmistakable. So every single one of our democracies has a task in front of it. And I think the fact that you become a successful and consolidated democracy never means that you can stay still or be complacent or rest on your laurels. Every single country faces a moving target precisely because of this growing middle class and the rise of new actors that think differently. And in order to keep up with that dynamic process, there has to be a constant process of political construction. So let me just end by talking a little bit about the short term. So everything I've spoken about up to this point is kind of at a very abstract and grand level about alternative models and long-term development. Let me just say a little bit about the way I see the world right now. And I think it's not good. I think we, in the short run, face some very severe challenges. Incidentally, Latin America is one of the regions where I think we're going to do okay, despite some obvious problems. But this is not the part of the world that I worry about the most. I think that Walter Russell Mead, who is one of my colleagues back in the United States, a foreign policy commentator, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs recently where he talked about the return of geopolitics. And unfortunately, I think that's true, that nationalism and national self-assertion have been put back on the table by both Russia and China. The European settlement after the Cold War was dependent on Russia and Russians accepting the fact that those ethnic Russians who were trapped outside of Russia would be content to remain in those countries. And with the annexation of Crimea, Mr. Putin has thrown all of that into question. He's basically said to every Russian minority living in Estonia or Moldova or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, if you're a Russian living outside of Russia and you're unhappy with your situation, you can count on Russia to come to your assistance. That is the precedent that's been set in Crimea. And even if Mr. Putin does not intend this, I think that he is opening the door to a tremendous amount of instability as these problems, as these local populations begin to think about their own situation down the road. In the Far East, I am extremely worried, and if I had to point to a region where I thought there was the strongest possibility of actual military conflict in the near term, it would be East Asia. If you travel through China, Japan, Korea, there has been a huge increase in nationalism. Unlike Europe, the countries of East Asia didn't learn a lesson about the evils of nationalism as a result of having fought the Second World War. And I must say that the level of nationalism in all of those countries is today higher. It's higher among young people than it was among their parents' generation. And I think a lot of it is simply driven by the fact that China is on its way to being possibly the world's leading economic power. It's a huge country. It feels that it has been humiliated for the 100 years of humiliation. It's gotten back to being established as a world power under the Communist Party, but that other people, other countries like Japan and the United States don't recognize its status in the world. And that's what I think these territorial issues in Southeast Asia and and with Japan are all about. And so this is a set of problems that I don't expect to be easily resolved. I think in a certain way, it's like dealing with Germany's rise prior to the First World War. This is the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I, and there's a lot of speculation about the similarities, and I think that we're not quite there yet. I don't think that situation is as dangerous, but there are real dangers, I think, in that part of the world. The final thing is about the Middle East. So as an American, I have for the last decade believed that the United States overreacted to the threat of terrorism after September 11th, and that we got into at least one completely unnecessary war that has now cost nearly $1 trillion in direct costs and then lots and lots of lives and permanently disabled people, both in America and in the Middle East, as a result. And I think that in a certain sense we're still in danger of making that misestimation, because I think what's actually happening now in Iraq and in Syria is the spread of a civil war between Sunnis and Shiites. It's not a fight between democracy and tyranny, or democracy and terrorism. It's a sectarian war that's now taking place within the borders of Islam, in which these different groups are acting as proxies for the big powers, meaning Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I think this is going to go on for some time, and it's going to be quite devastating to the populations of the people that live there, and it will have spillover effects in terms of radicalizing young people that may go back to the United States and Europe and other places. But in the scale of things, I do not think that this is as serious a challenge as the ones that are posed by either Russia or China, because in the end, you become a terrorist because you're weak. The reason that these people are spreading into Nigeria or Mali or Yemen is not because they're terribly powerful people. It's because the governments there are so weak that they can't prevent them from operating. And so therefore, I do think that we need to keep this threat in a little bit of perspective. And I say this as an American because as the President of the United States, it's really hard to tell your own people, calm down a little bit. This really isn't as serious a challenge as you think it is. So I'll end on just a final observation about the United States. President Obama has come in for a lot of criticism, especially recently, for seeming to be weak, indecisive, not standing up to these different kinds of challenges. And I have a certain sympathy with that. I don't think he naturally thinks about foreign affairs. He's much more focused on domestic issues. I do, however, think that he is reflecting accurately the public mood in the United States. After two very costly Middle East wars, I think that actually, for all the criticism President Obama gets, most Americans are really not eager to rush into a new conflict with Russia or China or get back into Iraq or Afghanistan, any of these places. But I do think that this kind of American withdrawal, which we've seen before, we saw this after Vietnam, is dangerous for the world, because there's a lot of countries that depend on American power and support around the world. And I think all of those countries are worried right now, because they're worried that the United States has taken a break, that it may come back in another 10 or 20 years, but in the meantime, they've got to deal with hostile neighbors and, immediate threats and so forth. But I guess my final observation would be that America proceeds by leadership in foreign policy. And so it's possible to turn this around, using the right kind of leadership. I remember during the Cold War, there would be polls where Americans would be asked, would you come to the defense of Germany and NATO if it were invaded by the Soviet Union? And a majority of Americans would say, no, I don't think it's worth it. But nonetheless, the United States stuck it out for 40 years and basically won the Cold War. And so I think that this is something that's more determined by elites than by public opinion necessarily. And I think, therefore, that the future of American foreign policy remains yet to be written. So thank you very much for your attention. And
a continuación, palabras del señor viceministro encargado de Relaciones Exteriores, embajador Claudio de la Puente.
Muy buenas noches. Saludo de la manera más cordial, respetuosa, en la presencia del expresidente de la República, Alejandro Toledo, señora, y del expresidente de la República, del Estado Plurinacional de Bolivia, el doctor Carlos Mesa. El doctor Francis Fukuyama, un saludo de la manera más cordial, de la misma manera. señor ex canciller, señor secretario general, señor presidente de la Comisión de Relaciones Exteriores del Congreso, señores congresistas, señores miembros de la comunidad académica, señores miembros de la prensa, excelentísimos señores embajadores acreditados ante el Gobierno del Perú, colegas diplomáticos, alumnos de la Academia Diplomática, exministros de Estado, señoras y señores. Deseo agradecer en nombre del señor Canciller de la República, al embajador Gonzalo Gutiérrez, al doctor Francis Fukuyama, por su magistral presentación y por la gentileza de venir a esta casa, a Torre Tagle, sede de la diplomacia peruana, para compartir con nosotros sus ideas y planteamientos sobre temas de la mayor relevancia para nuestra región y ciertamente para el Perú. Agradezco igualmente a la Asociación de Funcionarios del Servicio Diplomático del Perú, a su presidente, y a ESAM por hacer posible para todos nosotros el privilegio de contar con una figura intelectual del prestigio y del perfil del doctor Fukuyama en Lima y en esta casa. El profesor Fukuyama ha hecho gala de su lucidez y profundidad para analizar las complejidades de la realidad internacional y nos deja un mensaje ciertamente alentador en sus apuntes que ha hecho sobre nuestra región, América Latina y sobre sus perspectivas. Como ha mencionado el presidente de la Asociación de Funcionarios del Servicio Diplomático, hace más de 20 años el profesor Fukuyama provocó una verdadera revolución en el mundo académico, con su reconocida tesis sobre el fin de la historia, que ha sido ya mencionada, con la consolidación global de la democracia liberal y la libertad económica. Su planteamiento fue objeto de extensos análisis y debates académicos y políticos en diferentes partes del mundo, incluyendo ciertamente al Perú. En el tiempo transcurrido desde entonces, el profesor Fukuyama ha continuado su prolífica obra, desarrollando planteamientos y concentrándolos en nuevas preocupaciones globales, como los retos de la gobernabilidad y el fortalecimiento del rol del Estado en el crecimiento y desarrollo de los países. Hoy, el doctor Fukuyama continúa estimulando el debate y ha querido compartir con nosotros sus valiosas reflexiones en torno al futuro de nuestra región, pero también una visión comprensiva respecto a la escena contemporánea. La evolución de los hechos en América Latina ha dejado en evidencia la actualidad del pensamiento del doctor Fukuyama respecto a la extensión de la institucionalidad democrática y los principios de la libertad económica como fundamentos para avanzar y consolidar el desarrollo. En su obra ha reconocido y ha puesto énfasis en la importancia de las políticas de transparencia en el manejo público para ahondar la legitimidad social de nuestras instituciones estatales. Recientes experiencias regionales permiten constatar la pertinencia de estos planteamientos, como se refleja en uno de los mecanismos de integración más audaces e innovadores de América Latina, la Alianza del Pacífico. Este modelo moderno y joven aún, pues no han pasado más de 3 años desde su creación, fue gestado en el Perú y ha despertado un interés inusitado dentro y fuera de la región, siendo ya 32 los países observadores, entre ellos las principales economías del mundo. No obstante, las limitaciones y capacidades en muchos estados de América Latina, nuestros países han encarado la crisis financiera internacional en mejores condiciones que otras regiones del mundo. Así lo recordaba también el doctor Fukuyama. Y en el Perú incluso ha logrado mantener tasas de crecimiento encima del promedio regional. América Latina ha demostrado que ya no puede ser considerada una región marginal en el escenario global. Y en el caso específico del Perú, podemos empezar a pensar en nuestro país, y así debemos hacerlo, como una potencia regional emergente de mediana dimensión, tal como hace pocos días en esta misma casa nos señalaba el canciller Gonzalo Gutiérrez. El buen desempeño de esta economía ha reflejado en sus principales indicadores, y el manejo prudente de las finanzas ha sido materia de reconocimiento internacional. Ayer, para citar solo un ejemplo muy reciente, la agencia calificadora de riesgo Moody's asignó al Perú la categoría A3, similar a la que ostenta México, subiendo 2 escalas respecto a la posición anterior. Ello representa un reconocimiento a la performance de nuestra economía, pero también es una clara señal de confianza en el futuro del Perú. Señoras y señores, desde principios de siglo hemos sido testigos del renovado debate político y académico sobre el papel del Estado en el desarrollo de las naciones. El doctor Fukuyama ha expuesto con brillantez su visión sobre este tema en particular, recalcando la relevancia de las instituciones estatales y la necesidad de reflexionar con mayor detenimiento en torno al fortalecimiento institucional, condición necesaria para promover el desarrollo. El doctor Fukuyama subraya la necesidad estratégica de fortalecer las instituciones del Estado y hacerlo más eficiente. El gobierno peruano coincide ciertamente con esa perspectiva y considera que, además de ello, al Estado le corresponde desempeñar un papel más activo en políticas públicas de desarrollo social. Es bajo esa óptica que el gobierno ha puesto énfasis en la implementación de políticas de inclusión y de mejoras en la salud, educación, dirigidas a combatir tanto la pobreza como la desigualdad, elementos que precisamente el doctor Fukuyama resaltaba o señalaba como las demandas crecientes de las poblaciones frente a los estados democráticos y a sus gobiernos, ¿no? Este enfoque estatal del gobierno ha permitido que en el transcurso de los últimos años 1 millón de peruanos hayan dejado de ser pobres. Antes de finalizar estas breves palabras de agradecimiento, quisiera reconocer nuevamente la presencia de 2 señores expresidentes que contribuyeron decididamente al fortalecimiento de la institucionalidad democrática en nuestra región e impulsaron activamente el desarrollo de sus países y la estabilidad y la integración en América Latina. Le agradecemos sinceramente, profesor Fukuyama, por haber compartido con nosotros sus reflexiones y esperamos ciertamente que en un futuro cercano tengamos nuevamente el privilegio de tenerlo aquí presente. Les agradezco mucho por su atención. Muchas gracias.
Acto seguido se da inicio a la ceremonia de condecoración con la orden al mérito de la Asociación de Funcionarios del Servicio Diplomático del Perú, Mariscal Ramón Castilla, en el grado de Gran Cruz, al doctor Francis Fukuyama. Lectura del diploma de honor. El presidente de la Asociación de Funcionarios del Servicio Diplomático del Perú, Gran Maestre de la Orden, al mérito de la Asociación de Funcionarios del Servicio Diplomático del Perú, Mariscal Ramón Castilla, por cuanto, en sesión del Consejo Directivo de fecha 25 de junio de 2014, ha conferido al profesor Francis Fukuyama, por sus méritos y servicios, la condecoración de Gran Cruz de la Orden al mérito de la Asociación de Funcionarios del Servicio Diplomático del Perú, Mariscal Ramón Castilla. Vengo a expedirle el presente diploma y refrendado por el vicepresidente de la Orden. Lima, 3 de julio de 2014. A continuación, el presidente de la Asociación de Funcionarios del Servicio Diplomático del Perú, embajador Alfredo Chuquiguara, procederá a imponer la condecoración al doctor Francis Fukuyama. Se procede a la fotografía de estilo. Señoras y señores, el evento que nos congrega hoy ha concluido y se invita a los distinguidos asistentes a compartir un pisco de honor en el segundo piso. Agradeceremos a los invitados permanecer en sus lugares por breves momentos para que los miembros de la mesa de honor puedan desplazarse al segundo piso, donde se llevará a cabo el pisco de honor. Muchas gracias.